Okay, so this is the translation. Just pause the video here and take a few minutes to read it through. And then I'll pick out a few things which I think might need a bit of explanation. So, first of all, what I've translated as "you would be back to your old self." This in the Latin is similem te futurum tui, would be similar to yourself, is what it literally means. I think the rest of it is fairly straightforward. Feel free to ping me some questions if you're not sure about any aspect of the translation. What I think we need to do now is look a little bit at the context of what's going on here. So we're starting, remember, on the 15th of March, on the day of Caesar's assassination, and Cicero's talking about what happens in the couple of days following that. So if we scroll up, let's take a look here. So we start on the Ides of March, the 15th of March, with the murder of Julius Caesar. And in the previous chapter, Cicero's already told us that Antony fled the scene and returned home aided by nameless people, friends of some description. The conspirators, or the liberators, as Cicero calls them, go up to the Capitoline Hill and basically try and gauge public opinion. How has Caesar's assassination gone down? Do people like it? Do people dislike it? And it's pretty unpopular. And they realise that if they want to avert further bloodshed, which, it's not their intention to start killing the entirety of the Senate or the entirety of Caesar's supporters, then they need to negotiate. And so the conspirators begin to negotiate with Antony, who's the consul, and with a guy called Lepidus, who's effectively Caesar's second in command. So that night, Antony, possibly along with Lepidus, summons some of Caesar's troops into the city. Now, this obviously is quite a statement of power, and quite a proactive move on Antony's part. He really seems to be taking control. Caesar's widow Calpurnia gives him Caesar's state papers, so from her point of view, he's effectively Caesar's successor, and she also gives him money, and he gets the war chest that Caesar was saving up for the campaign he was planning against the Parthians. So at this point, despite the way that Cicero has portrayed him as having just kind of scurried off home, Antony's actually doing things, and he's putting himself into a position of authority. Now, it doesn't say this here, but I've just added as a note that this evening Cicero actually asks the conspirators to call a Senate meeting on the Capitol. He sees the way things are going. He realises that Antony and Lepidus and all of Caesar's other supporters are kind of massing, and he realises that this is the perfect opportunity, if the conspirators want to seize power in Rome, for them to strike before Antony really gets his act together. But the conspirators refuse. And so the next day, the 16th of March, there are further negotiations between Antony and the conspirators, who at this point are obviously terrified that they're going to be sentenced to death for having assassinated Caesar. And actually, Antony and Lepidus act pretty diplomatically here. So they hand over their own sons as hostages to the conspirators, and Antony basically averts civil war, at least for the moment, by his willingness to negotiate with the conspirators. Now, that's obviously not how Cicero frames it. Cicero's focus here is on Antony's fear. He says metueres and timore. So he's really keen to portray Antony as somebody who's basically just too scared to act, whereas actually Antony is, doing quite a lot behind the scenes and making sure that the supporters of Caesar and the conspirators, the liberators, don't outright come to blows. On the 17th of March then, so this is the post-diem tertium that Cicero mentions, they hold a Senate meeting in the Temple of Tellus. Caesar's veterans surround the building, so again there's this sense now in Rome that Caesar's supporters have the upper hand, but they end up with a compromise. So Cicero is involved quite heavily in this. He gets amnesty for the assassins, so they're not going to be killed themselves. But in return for that, all of Caesar's already published acts and arrangements, so basically everything that Caesar had done whilst he was alive, gets ratified. So even though he's been assassinated, everything that he did still stands. So essentially, the supporters of Caesar, so Antony and Lepidus, kind of come out on top here. And again, that's not the way that Cicero wants to portray it. And in fact, if you want to pause here for a second and just read through what Gildenhard has to say about this, the main point is that Cicero is very kind of black and white in the way that he portrays this. All he's saying is that Antony was a coward, and politics is reduced to personality. He also portrays himself as somebody who warned against compromise. And bear in mind, he's now speaking at a point where Antony is kind of becoming a public enemy, or Octavian, at least, is trying to frame Antony as a public enemy. What Cicero is trying to suggest here is that if everybody had just listened to him, then they wouldn't have compromised with Antony, and they wouldn't now be in this situation where Antony is a threat to the state. Okay, so once you've paused and sort of digested that a bit, let's go up and have a look at some of these annotations that I've made on the text. The colour coding doesn't particularly mean anything, it's just to kind of break it up a little bit. Again, pause the video at this point and see if you can work out why I've highlighted the things that I've highlighted. What is it about those, whether it's a language point, a style point, a content point, that makes them significant. All right, so we start obviously with this exclamation, and there's a real sense of pathos here. Cicero's showing almost pity for himself in a way. I don't think we're supposed to read it as self-pitying in a way that we can criticise, but he's saying, oh, if only people had listened to me. He's painting himself as a kind of Cassandra figure. Cassandra, remember, in the Trojan War, was doomed to always predict the future, but never to be believed. So she predicted the downfall of Troy, and no one listened to her, and Troy was destroyed. So, frustra semper verissima, the superlative here, Cicero saying, you know, his predictions, his prophecies are not just right, but utterly correct, absolutely truthful. But as well as being truthful, they're always frustra, they're always in vain. So Cicero is constantly trying hard to do the right thing and to help the Republic, and he's never listened to. And the word semper here, note how it's in the middle of frustra and verissima. It applies to both of those words. So his auguries, his prophecies are always in vain and always truthful. This is called apokoinou, this use of the word. And it's Greek and it means kind of like from both, or from each of them. So it applies to both words. Then we've got dikebam. Dikebam obviously is imperfect, and it's this idea of repeated action. Cicero kept saying to the liberators that Antony would, do one thing or say one thing and do another. And again, it's Cicero portraying himself as the voice of authority, but the voice of authority who keeps being ignored. I kept saying, and they kept failing to listen. He clearly nails his colours to the mast here by calling them liberatoribus nostris. So obviously if you were on Caesar's side, you wouldn't think of these people as liberatores, you'd think of them as sicarii, assassins, or tyrannicides. Sorry, not tyrannicides, that's what Cicero would think. But you'd think of them as terrible people. Cicero is saying not only are they liberators, they're nostris liberatoribus, they're our liberators. So he's being really emphatic here that he thinks Caesar was rightly assassinated. So he says, I kept saying that you would promise omnia quoad metueres, since or for as long as you were afraid. So it's this idea of Antony as not only a total coward, but as somebody who's really unprincipled. So he'll say whatever he has to to save his own skin because he's frightened. And what the liberators want Cicero to do is to go to Antony and urge him to defend the Republic. Now, this is ironic for a couple of reasons. First of all, Antony is the consul, so it's his job to defend the Republic. Now that makes things difficult for the conspirators, because if Antony's the consul and his job is to defend the Republic, then it's kind of his job to kill them because they've assassinated the head of the state. Cicero obviously is being ironic in as much as he doesn't think that Antony is a particularly good person to defend the Republic, particularly because he's such a coward. And he goes on. So Cicero told the liberators that Antony would promise everything, but then as soon as he stopped being afraid, he would go back to being his old self, similem te futurum tui. And I think there's a deliberate echo here in simul ac and then similem. So the very moment that he stops being afraid, he will be just like he was before. And it's not quite polyptoton, but the similarity in those words, I think, highlights that idea. So the Ceteri consulares. Now the consulares are anybody who has previously been a consul. That includes Cicero himself, as I said in the notes. But most of the old consuls had died in the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey. And so really Cicero is one of the only kind of loyal old guard who remains. And these consuls are clearly pretty unprincipled as well. They're kind of coming and going, errant, rederent. There's a syndeton here, errant, rederent, to show, I suppose, the frequency of them, trotting back and forth between the conspirators and Antony carrying messages. So whilst they're doing that, Ceteri, in sententia mansi, I stayed firm in my opinion. And so Cicero is setting himself up in contrast not only to the other consulars, but also to Antony, because remember, he's just said here that Antony is really unprincipled, omnia te promissorum. Well, Cicero wouldn't do that. If he means something, then he sticks by it. So a really strong contrast between Cicero and Antony, but also Cicero and the other consulars as well. Okay, so he says, I didn't see you, Antony. And note, actually, that he's talking to Antony here again. So it's this idea of it being a speech, even though it wasn't ever delivered. So I didn't see you that day. I didn't see you on the next day. Nor did I believe that ullam societatem. So there's a few things going on here. First of all, you've got the connotations of the word societas. This is a really Roman concept, the idea of, a socius, an ally, somebody with whom you have a sort of a trustworthy and reciprocal relationship. And he says, I didn't think there could be any partnership, any allegiance for the Optimus citizens by ullo foedere, by any treaty. So there's a chiasmus, first of all, ullam societatem and foedere ullo. See how that works? And both of these words, so societas has this very Roman kind of connotation. Foedus as well. Foedus is a treaty, but it's a very kind of solemn word. It suggests something that has been, cosmically ordered. It's a little bit like the idea of fast, something that the gods approve of. So he's saying that no treaty and no partnership, no allegiance is possible with an importunissimo hoste. And he talks about the optimus quibus. Obviously, this is the best citizens, but it also implies the optimates, that political class who were not on Caesar's side. Caesar was a popular or a populist, remember. So what's he doing here? Well, he's stripping Antony of his Romanitas, of his Romanness. He's not worthy of any Societas. He's not worthy of any Foedus. He's far from being an Optimus Civis. In fact, Cicero's turned him into a hostis, to an enemy of Rome, somebody with whom no partnership or treaty is possible. So there's a lot going on in that sentence. And this is why Gildenhard says that this is really an attack on Antony's personality rather than a sort of a considered run through of the actual events of those few days. Finally then, Cicero says that on the third day, so on the 17th of March, I came to the Idem Telluris, to the Temple of Tellus, but I did it in Vetus. I wasn't really happy to do it, but I kind of had to. Why wasn't I happy? Because armed men, armati, were besieging omnes aditus, all of the entrances. And I think the omnes aditus armati obsiderant, there's something in the assonance there that might be worth pointing out. Just as a final thing to note, it's a bit ironic that the 17th of March, which is when this Senate meeting takes place, is the feast of the Liberalia. The Liberalia was a feast in honour of Liber Pater, who's kind of the Roman equivalent to Bacchus, really, so it's a bit of a boozy celebration. But Liber Pater obviously means like the free father, so Liberalia means something like the festival of freedom. And it's quite ironic that, all of this takes place, this liberation of the Republic from the tyranny of Caesar comes to its conclusion at the Liberalia.